You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now. This is modern love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Epps.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
How many of you, this is your first time here? Come back. It's go to our website, WBUR City Space. We have such an eclectic offering. We do music, we do policy debates, we do cooking, we do moth story slams, we do live podcasts, we do dance. We've done an opera coffee house, we've done crossword puzzles. We've done everything. I like to call it the 92nd Street Y of Boston. There's nothing quite like this in Boston. My name's Amy McDonald. I program this place, and it's killing me, but it's a good death. And just so you know, it's such a streetscape. There are microphones outside, so what we hear inside, you'll hear outside if you turn around. And Anthony and Jeremy, you may notice all of a sudden people will be jumping on the benches, especially when we have music and dance, and they'll be watching this. So it's such a civic offering to this city. So thank you for coming. Come back. And without further ado, Anthony Tommasini and Jeremy Eichler, you're in for a real treat.
All right. Hello. Thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here today speaking with all of you and with Tony Tommasini here in Boston with us to speak about his new book. A little bit of housekeeping to get out of the way. I'm told, perhaps you've already been told, that we'll be taking some questions near the end of our conversation, and instead of the old-fashioned way of letting us know what you'd like to ask, apparently we're going to be using a program called Slido, which you can access on your smartphones, and you type in the question, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask it, I hope. So it's really a pleasure and honor to be here speaking with Tony. The book is The Indispensables. It's highly recommended, and we're excited to share a little bit about what Tony's been thinking and writing about the last few years. We'll also hopefully have a chance to speak about criticism today in a very changing landscape in the media. But I just wanted to start just on a quick personal note. I've known Tony for I was thinking about this. I think, Tony, it's over 20 years, and since I first met Tony when I began going to concerts as a young critic in my early 20s and in New York. And it's interesting. Criticism, I don't know if you agree, Tony. It's one of these kind of fanciful jobs to be a classical music critic, where I feel like it's sort of the adult equivalent, maybe. In some people's imagination, it's sort of the adult equivalent of being a kid and thinking, maybe when I grow up, I'll be like a lollipop taster, or a video game, quality control person, and I think a lot of people have that idea of what we do as classical music critics, with sort of the rosy vision of what we do, and but yet, as you and I both know, it's always a lot more complicated than that. And Tony has been the chief critic at the New York Times, as you know, because you're here. He's been doing that in that role for almost 2 decades, and when you go to a concert or an opera performance, that part can be the fun part, but then you go home as a critic and you write. And classical music is very hard to write about. It's an experience in sound. If you think about it, it's an experience in sound, oftentimes without any words associated. And yet what we do as critics is to turn it into an experience for readers that's only in words. And it's really difficult to do. You do it at an extremely high level with so much discernment and a kind of passion to educate that I just wanted to begin by just taking a moment for all of us to be able to honor and acknowledge your 2 decades of leading the field.
Thank you so much. That's very nice. Thank you.
So we're here to talk about the Indispensables, and this is a book about 17 composers. Why don't we start, Tony, if it's okay? I'd just like to, perhaps you could share with the group here a little bit about how this whole thing came about. The book, what led you at this point in your career to take on a project like this, and what you were hoping to accomplish with it.
In 2011, I did this crazy thing at the Times. I'm not generally as a critic, I don't like lists, I don't rate things, and it was sort of out of character, but I just said, if you're going to pick the 10 greatest composers who ever lived, how would you do it? How would you go about it? So I had a big 2-week project, the Top 10 Composers project, where I wrote 5 articles. I made these 5 videos where the Times video crew comes over to my apartment and I sit at the piano like I'm going to do in a while and play things and talk about music just like Uncle Lenny. And then we had comments posted, thousands of comments from people were posted online. And it was all an intellectual game, but yet it's amazing because I had some people write, Nico Muhly on his blog, the composer, described it as a horror, which I sort of liked actually. But other people, really big musicians, got involved. Jeremy Denk, Manny Axe. They all got swept up in it, and then a lot of people. I got a lot of notes from people who wrote in comments and saying, "This whole thing is ridiculous. It's absurd. But here's my top 10 list." But it was just a game. But and then I was approached by Penguin. Then I got 2 publishers approached me during the course of this too. And I said, turn it into a book. I said, no, as an intellectual game, it's one thing, but a book, no, that's ridiculous. But I thought about it, and I thought if I could write a book about greatness that got at the complexity of the 2 sides to greatness in all the arts, but especially in classical music, and make it personal, make it mine, maybe that would be valuable. Maybe that could be, that would be something I could be proud of, I think. But the problem with the challenge in the book was that it reads, I was afraid it was going to read suspiciously like a book called The Great Composers. And we are, in all the arts, I think we're a little too obsessed with the canon, with the greats of all time. Often to the neglect of living artists. And the most important thing I do as a critic by far is write about new music, new artists. So I was a little worried, but on the other hand, we can't help it. These people, these giants, they claim us. They practically coax us through life. And so I tried to take on all these issues in the first chapter, where I spend the first half taking apart the whole thing of greatness and, why are we obsessed with it? What does it matter? But then halfway through, I say, but we can't help it. We just can't help it. Every time I go to a Shakespeare play, I walk out thinking, why don't I read anything else, really? Why waste my time? It's only for a moment. You're so swept up. In that moment, I think this is the greatest creative artist in the history of the world. He just is, And then the next day you realize, well, of course, there are other great artists and there are other great playwrights. But that's what I try to get at. In every chapter, I try to say, what is the big deal about Mozart? What is the big deal about Chopin? Why are they so great? I try to write about them even in their own lives as the contemporary composers they were in their day, and try to capture that. And then there's lots of personal stuff in it, because often my first impressions of these great pieces came when I was a kid, and I sort of cue into that in the book to try to recapture it, before I write.
Right, absolutely. Maybe I actually had wanted to ask you exactly about that personal dimension. The book opens very affectingly with an image that you paint of you as a kid listening in your home in Long Island in a Finnish basement den, right, where you had your old upright and you had your records. You point out for readers just a little bit of the improbability of the fact that you're sitting there in this room because you didn't have a single relative. You had not a parent, not you. I think you're right that you didn't even have an aunt or uncle who had sung in a chorus, right, let alone someone who could really guide you into this. So you were sort of with teachers. I trust you, but you were really kind of finding your way into it, and you also write affectingly about some of your kind of emotional journey of just going through your teenage years and finding in the music a kind of mirror for some of those emotions and some of those depths. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about before we know all the context and the richness and when Beethoven came to Vienna and what all the chronologies were. What was it like for you to encounter music in this sort of more in the wild state, and what did it mean to you at that point in your life, and how did those experiences in a way launch you on your own musical journey? The thing about, that's a big question. The thing about music, almost everyone has some music they're passionate about. Music makes us passionate, and yet we have to admit, in our culture, we are generally, by and large, not well educated musically. A lot of people go to concerts all the time, don't know the ins and outs of music, they can't read music, but that's fine, because so much of music is instinctive. I had friends from over a while ago, and neither of them are musicians, and but they go to concerts all the time and operas all the time. And this one guy, Ben, asked me, he and his partner Adam, they got into a sort of thing about major, minor, what is that? And he said, can you explain? I said, Ben, I'm going to sit at the piano, I'll explain it to you, but I just wanted you to understand, already. You do know the difference. Your ear knows, your perceptions know, you do know. You may think you don't, but you do. So when you sit down and show them, there's like this epiphany, like, yeah, that's what I'm hearing. So there I was, a kid. No one in my family was musical. I was like Schroeder. I had a toy piano, and I was picking out tunes on it, and I just had this ear, and I kept screaming at my parents, "I want a piano!" And I was 8 years old when they finally got one. They said, "He must mean it," and. But so I was kind of isolated, and it's funny, it comes up in the greatness bit, because when I'm making
my point that greatness shouldn't matter, this whatever, posterity and stuff, I learned early because my first favorite composer was Grieg, Edvard Grieg, the Norwegian composer. I still love his music. And I had this record, Rubinstein Plays Grieg, on the piano. And there was one song, The Shepherd Boy, a little lyric piece for piano. It's so sad, and I in the book I say, what made that? Why is that Norwegian shepherd boy so sad? And I said, because I could be a sad kid too, especially because I felt isolated, sitting in the basement, listening to these things. But this is the thing about being a Times critic. Years and years later, I get to go to Norway to cover a festival in Risør on the east coast near Oslo. But before then, I get to go to Bergen. I went to Bergen, Grieg's home, and I wound up writing a travel piece for the Times about Grieg's Norway. But I went to his home on the outskirts of Bergen, and I said, hey, I'm the Times critic, and they let me play his piano. And I played one of those lyric pieces, looking at the piano off to this lake, and there was a picture on the piano of a little girl, Christina, was his wife, Nina, who was a singer. They had one daughter, Christina, who died at 13 months old of meningitis. And I was playing a lullaby, that Grieg had written. So, oh my gosh. But that was one of the perks of being a Times critic. I remember that connected so powerfully to my childhood. And another Times thing, I wrote a piece. When I wrote that piece, guess who I hear from? One of Arthur Rubinstein's sons, who wanted to make a present to me of Rubinstein's personal copy of Rubinstein Plays Grieg. So that was amazing. I'm sorry, that probably didn't answer your question, though. But
No, it's great. Yeah, it's interesting. Then moving on from your own childhood, the book is also peppered with all sorts of memories that you have of taking in particular astonishing performances, like Rudolf Serkin playing some of the first performances he had, some of his first times in taking on some of the late Beethoven sonatas that you heard at Carnegie Hall, Hammerklavier and others. And so this is skipping ahead a little bit to talk a tiny bit about criticism. I want to come back to the book in a moment, but I wonder if how you think about what it's like to then sit down with all of these amazing performances in memory, how you think about the challenge of sitting down to hear a debuting performer taking on some of the same repertoire that you've heard performed by some of these great pianists of the 20th century, and how conscious it is to kind of make your mind blank, or whether there's something instructive for you about the dialogue between past memories and what you're currently hearing in the moment of a concert coming off the stage.
Criticism. To me, people do it differently. There are two components to it. I'm a journalist. I'm reporting the news. The Met season is opening soon with a new production of Porgy and Bess. There's a lot of news to report. How is it? What's the production like? How does the opera fare these days? Is it dated now? Is it do you have to bring context to it? I think it's a great work, but so it's my job to just report on all that. But the other part is my personal reactions to things. And people always say, you sort of mentioned something like this, that, your job, you get to you go to all these things, and you get to go to Salzburg, and you go to the Bayreuth Festival, and you do all these things. And, what a job. And I say, yeah. The job is going home and writing about it. Going is easy, but then you have to write about it. And the really challenging part is the writing. That it's very, very hard to describe sound in words. The easiest is being an opera critic, because I'm half theater critic, so I can write about costumes and stories and plots and acting and but but I try. It's really I really try. But the thing about that's interesting about great performances that I've heard of the standard repertoire. Whenever I've talked to music students at Juilliard or any place, they'll say, "How do we get your attention?" And I'll say, I'll tell you, playing a new piece, playing something I don't know, repertoire that we don't know. A new piece by definition, or a recent piece, is news. I work for a newspaper. So there's this Finnish pianist, Juho Bojonen, his name is. He's now regular with the Chamber Music Society, but he was like 22 years old. I heard his debut in New York. It was a model debut. He played some Schumann, I think the fantasy pieces, and a Mozart sonata, but he also played some Sibelius pieces, being Finnish. That he played that, and he played. Talk about Finnish music. He played this piece Staccato Me by Esa-Pekka Salonen, which about 22 minutes. Oh my God, it's hard. Oh yeah, it's so hard. And this skinny little Finnish guy, nailed it. So boy, did I have a lot to write about. Now in that case, there was so much news that I didn't have to compare his performance of the fantasy pieces of Schumann to Rubinstein or Murray Pariah or anybody. I could just say, this guy is a really live and kicking musician. He's terrific, and he played this terrific. And by the way, he also played Schumann very beautifully. I don't have to rank it in comparison with other performances. I can just say he can do that too.
Right. Yes, I can absolutely relate to what you're saying about being able to respond more freshly to works that don't have this big kind of, don't come trailing this kind of big,
right.
All of this baggage of so many recordings, so many performances. It's interesting, though, to switch back to turn angle us back towards the book. And yet here we have a book on the indispensable composers, and the most contemporary composer that's in the book is Bartók and Stravinsky. Right. So I guess I wanted to ask how you decided to take us in the first composer, just for people's reference, because I'm not assuming that the book that you've all had a chance to look at the book yet, though you should. This book starts with Monteverdi and then goes all the way through a chapter on Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and Bartók. So how did you choose to put the boundary there, and do you have other indispensable composers after that somehow there just wasn't time or space to write about?
No, it was since it is a book about great, these towering figures. I mean, there are all sorts of side trips I take to people. Like when I write about Schumann, I write about Clara Schumann also, and Liszt comes up and also when I get to the Bartók and those, I mean, I do, like in the first, I write about John Adams, I write about Kaya Sariaho's opera, and at the end, but it's true, I wanted to stick, one thing I've said that I've gotten in trouble with some critics and some friends about that, and maybe I don't explain it so well, but I said that one thing I love about new art and all the arts is that the question of lasting greatness, of posterity, you're relieved from. You don't have to, like if there's an exciting new novel, you want your friends to read it, you want to talk about it, this is so great. But when you say it's such a great book, you're not necessarily saying lasting great. You're not putting it in the pantheon. You're just saying, wow, you don't want to miss this. I mean, we all know that, I don't know, history will come along, maybe they will. And I use Adams as I talk about an Adams piece that I really like, and but who knows what history will make of that. But I decided to start with Monteverdi because Renaissance and medieval music, it's so different. It really is like another realm. There are complicated things about why that is in the way contrapuntal textures dominated things, but Monteverdi is like the first composer that There's a very famous biography of him that's subtitled "Inventor of Modern Music," and Leo Schroeder, he means modern in the sense of the way college survey history courses are divided into ancient and modern history, and modern is like roughly 1600 or so, and I agree with that. And then I went through the big three, Schoenberg and Stravinsky and Bartók, and thought that was a good. It seems to me the 20th century and from the last 100 years is another book. It's a different book. And maybe I'll write that book someday, but it just seemed like I couldn't do all that, because we're still wondering, well, I don't know, this greatness thing. There's this composer in England, George Benjamin, who wrote this opera, Written on Skin, which is astonishing. If that doesn't make the pantheon, I don't know what will. But in a way, I don't even like referring to it that way, because it makes it seem too kind of already calcified or something. It's just, if you don't know it, if you get a chance to hear it, there's a tremendous recording of it and a good video. But who knows? Who knows? What 100 years from now or 200 years people will say. But that's why I stop.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hear what you're saying absolutely about the idea that when we think about contemporary art, we can't even, as critics or as readers or concertgoers, we can't. We're sort of released from the obligation to ask how this will be looked at in 100 years, because we can't possibly know.
Right.
That said, it is interesting, sort of sociologically. One hears said often, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but that classical music audiences, by and large, are more resistant to possibly en masse to encountering new things in this field of the performing arts than, say, someone who loves literature and will of course want to have some contemporary writers on their bookshelf, or loves art and was happy to go see a new gallery show or something at contemporary painter at the local museum. So it is interesting to think about how this greatness concept also is perhaps the flip side of that. That even if we're not talking about it when we respond to contemporary art, this kind of legacy of greatness is still very much this kind of center of gravity in our field, and has, as you acknowledge in your introduction, this double edge to it.
I think this is an issue in all the arts, but I think especially in classical music. There are a lot of complicated reasons for this. I take a stab at answering that question in the last chapter of the book. To do the kind of short version of it, my theory of, in other words, the question is, why are classical music audiences more traditional-minded, a larger majority of them than in maybe for theater, for example, or dance. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were all these experiments in all the arts and in sciences and stuff, and that happened in music too, with Arnold Schoenberg coming along and the breakdown of the major-minor key system and atonality and total, all these things were going on. At the same time, the invention of technology, of radios and phonographs came along. That was different. That, all of a sudden, if you didn't like the crazy new music, you could sit at home and listen to your Caruso records or your Beethoven symphonies. And I think it enabled people to be more resistant. Then also that same technology empowered all these performers, who became this real powers in the field. It used to be composers were the big shots, but now it was the celebrity performers, the touring performers and conductors who had all. And so the field started splitting and it's complicated. Then composers wound up drifting into universities, which was both good and bad. And good in that they had stability and a job, bad in that they were isolated, that they started writing for each other, rather than There's this Beethoven story I love where one of the baffling lay quartets, the B flat, ends with the grosse fugue. This, many of you may know this, almost like 20-minute, practically crazy fugue. It's the sixth movement. And the quartet actually played it and got through it. They played it when it was new. But then his publisher said, gee, maestro, isn't that a little much? Maybe you want to do something else? And he didn't say, how dare you? He said, okay. And he wrote a much simpler movement, for the published version. Now it's very common to play the grosse fugue, but, as the last movement. And we've kind of wrestled with it and learned it. But I love that Beethoven thought, well, okay, I want it to sell after all. So.
Yeah. Well, I think it's nice that you're mentioning the grosse fuga here because that piece is best known for its dissonance, right, as kind of shocking people at that time. And I think we're fortunate enough to have a piano here on stage, and Tony had also, I think, is prepared to share with us some of his thoughts, not through his words but through his music on the idea of dissonance.
Well, yeah. Let me switch. This on? Yes? Okay. This does relate to the book in that I do try to capture what it was like for me when I first heard these pieces. And one of the big first impressions I had as I don't know, I must have been maybe 11 or something, was Chopin's G minor ballade. It would be years and years before I learned to play it. I did when I was in high school, and then also at a recital at Yale. But the moment that here I was already playing the piano, but I didn't know harmony. I didn't know theoretical concepts. But there's something about the way it opens with this in stern unison, an octave, like somebody talking to you, And then there's this three-note riff, which I'm going to play, which has this piercing dissonance in it. Then it just sort of hangs there, and then it goes into the saddest melody you've ever heard. And let me play it first, then I'll go back and I'm just going to play the first chunk of it. What's happening? So I don't want to, I'm going to come back to it, but this much as a kid I got. It's like almost like operatic recitative, like whenever you hear something in unison, it's an instrument is imitating, singers. But you could almost make up words to it. I always think of it's like someone is reluctant to go on. Do I have to? Here's the story. Do I have to tell this story? And do I have to go into all the painful details? Then this voice comes and says, yes, you do. It's like, okay, you sure you want to go ahead? It's not too late to back out. This is going to get very intense. Okay, now dissonance. This is now a little mini class on dissonance. Dissonance is a very misunderstood word. We think of dissonance as, like something from the Stravinsky Rite of Spring, which is actually two very ordinary chords, but was put together as kind of this bitonal thing. But dissonance is really about tension. It's not harshness, it's about tension. Like if you take the notes of the scale, like they all have their own qualities that seem to, but the seventh especially, what is your ear? It's almost got a rhythmic element to it because you wanted to do that. So if you build chords, use them on the scale, you can do things like this, or in any key, or in the key of this Chopin, this G minor. But that's a dissonance. That's the tritone. In the Middle Ages, that was a diabolical interval. It was considered so, awful, but you wanted to do that, So using that, there's what's called progressive harmony, which doesn't mean hip, newfangled harmony. It means chords that push from one to the next, like any old hymn. Or here's Chopin in a kind of hymn mode from a ballade. So your ear, everybody's ear knows where's that going. I could hold that forever, and you'd still be waiting for it to do that. So that's dissonance. It's very, very useful dissonance, but it is dissonance. Now, there are neat tricks you can do, like Bach, here's a saraband that basically is in a minor key. The chords are these. Well, you think it's going to do this, but he actually has a little trick. He goes to an unexpected chord. But this is what he does. Okay, at that moment, boy, wow, that's as dissonant as this, in a way. But what Bach does, it's a very nifty trick that everybody else did. The chord goes there, but two notes get suspended. They kind of get left behind. So everybody's ear in this room, I'm sure, is telling you where. It doesn't sound dissonant at all because you know where it's going. It's going there. Okay. So Now, as zapping ahead, as music grew, composers played around with dissonance to use it in this progressive way to make one chord go to the next, but also just to dwell on it, to enjoy it, to savor it. Oh, beautiful, poignant. Here's a Schumann song from Dicta Libre. Now that's gorgeous, it's poignant, it's dissonant, it's tinged with, but what the hell's the key? Well, here's the tune. Lo and behold, so going ahead, this is, Wagner, let's skip him. But there's another thing about harmony that pushes ahead that sometimes people wanted to see the time, to have harmony that was progressive but not too, because they wanted it to keep going, circling. They wanted to have a riff that kept repeating. That was even back in the Baroque, where you had bass lines that would just repeat. Like here's from Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppea. So you put chords to those. So if you use just little elements of this progressive pushing kind of stuff, you have this kind of riff that keeps going. Here's a modern version of that same idea that I love. This is from Jonathan Larson's Rent. This is Seasons of Love. If you know this piece, this is really, I love these chords. See this big wide spaced chord? This is going, where do you want that to go? There, right. But he sort of does that, except it's very narrow. You hear how that works? But then we quickly get off it. It's just beautiful. Okay, now, as harmony developed, we had jazz, we had Debussy, we had Gershwin, and these chords started, that seventh, if you add it to everything, all of a sudden it cancels itself out. So you have chords like this. There it is. But it sounds wonderful. In fact, if you leave it out. What? There we go. That's much better, I'm going to skip Gershwin because I should. Okay, the final guy before I go back to this is, if you want a good example of somebody who uses harmony in all these senses, he uses that progressive sense of one chord pushing to the next, but also the just interesting sounds that are spiked with poignancy or pungency. It's Sondheim, to me. This is the opening of Sweeney Todd, the Ballad of Sweeney Todd. When the chorus sings, attend the tale of Sweeney Todd, but the accompaniment. Where's that resolve to? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway. I've lost it. Now he takes this little riff. Sorry. And when Sweeney sings his song, There Was a Barber and His Wife, we get a kind of version of it. There was a barber, his wife. There was a... And she was beautiful. There was a barber and his wife, and she was beautiful. Look what chord he puts on that. Now this is dissonance. This is sort of like that. It's just to get you, I think, anyway. We finally, it ends. That takes us right back to this. Okay. what's going on there. It's funny, when the melody starts, we have this little three-note thing. Everyone, we have this, these little three-note groups. Sorry. So he leaves you hanging. But every other three-note group that comes up in the melody winds up showing you exactly where the harmonies go. Here we go. But only this one he leaves you hanging. Why? But he winds up finally. He does show you where that resolves at the end in the big. Okay, remember, here we go. So there it is. Okay, so finally, after leaving you hanging, he finally, at the end of that phrase, he shows you, I know what you were expecting. Let me tie it off. And then we got to this part. And the piece really does take off and go very, 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 very passionate and very, very crazy. Now, Jeremy, you were asking about. Thanks. I do have another personal passage in the book in my Yale recital, at a Yale recital, and when I was a senior. I played that piece, and it was a very hard program. I had a Haydn sonata, and then my first late Beethoven sonata, Opus 110, and then a Schoenberg piece, my first big Schoenberg piece, and then the Chopin Ballade. And I write in the book that the Chopin was hard technically, but it was mainly hard emotionally, because it's so revealing. It's so exposed. I say in the book, I just turned 22. I was still sorting out being gay at a time when that was not easy. And there was, right at the recital in the audience close to me, there were a couple of guys who I had crushes on watching me play this piece. And I said that, this piece, I had no secrets when I played that piece. The Schoenberg, even the late Beethoven was mystical, it was hard, but Chopin, you're all out there.
There was nowhere to hide.
Nowhere to hide, yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you for sharing some of the music with us, Tony. It's a real pleasure, and it made me think while you were playing. It just occurred to me to ask whether you. First of all, just an observation. I've noted over the years that so many critics working today, and certainly in decades past, when they had training on particular instruments before they became critics, most typically it was on the piano, and so that's kind of interesting for me. Just in general, why is it that piano is the critic's instrument of choice? For me, I'm a string player, so and for me, it actually has brought a different perspective on responding to orchestras, I think. But I wonder for you, as a pianist, to what extent you feel like your fingertips, if you will, come into contact with the critical apparatus as you're writing a review. Do you find yourself going to the keyboard as you're looking at a new score? Do you find yourself playing it just for your own reference? How much does your identity or your experience as an active pianist inform your criticism?
To me, the piano is additionally handy for criticism in that you can play piano voice reductions of operas. You can play, there are all sorts of arrangements of pieces for piano. You really can I can go through a whole Wagner opera at the piano. So I do have. I think a pianist has an advantage in that over string players or other or even singers in a way. It's comprehensive in that way. Yes, I don't know. I am a professional writer. I have been for now like 30 years, but I still think of myself as a piano player, as a musician, at least as a musician. I don't really play the piano much anymore, but and it does inform everything I do, and I do. But the thing, there's the old stupid myth about criticism that critics are frustrated performers and stuff. That's just not true. The critics I know, that's not true at all. Nothing thrills me and excites me more than hearing the piano played beautifully. I'm a big fan. But there's a whole tradition, a very important tradition of composer critics. Like Schumann and Berlioz and Debussy was a terrific critic, and then my mentor Virgil Thompson, so that's another and maybe the best way into the job.
Right. Right. Well, since you brought up Virgil Thompson, would you like to tell us a little bit about your time with him? Tony authored an authoritative biography on Virgil Thompson, wonderful mid-century composer and critic. And I wondered if you cared to just reflect a little bit on specifically as a critic today, sort of what you took from your time with Virgil in terms of insights into the art of criticism or the craft of criticism.
Virgil I met through my friend Scott Wheeler, who I believe is here. We were both wound up teaching at Emerson College, started there new in 1978. And Virgil and Scott knew him already, had studied with him a little. And we put on a concert of his music. But then a couple of years later, I think it was 80, we put on The Mother of Us All at Emerson. And I fell in love with his opera. And I fell in love with it. And I wound up getting to know him, and I wrote my dissertation for BU on his musical portraits. He did these musical portraits of people, and he did them just like he would look at you and write, and what came out was your portrait. And he was very serious about it, and I wrote a book about that. And so I got to know him, and I wrote this book. But when I started as a freelancer at the Boston Globe, it was 86, he took me under wing. Virgil was a great composer and one of these American originals. I mean, he was of the Aaron Copland generation. But he was the best in this one dimension that it's so difficult to write in words what pieces sound like, what music sounds like. He, of all critics, was able in the most colloquial, homespun language to say the most sophisticated things about music and how, and now he was flawed. He had his prejudices as a critic. He got away with conflict of interest at the Herald Tribune that you couldn't imagine. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Music while he was a critic at the New York Herald Tribune, He conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra and stuff while he was a critic. I mean,
he got away with falling asleep at concerts.
He did that too. Yes, he used to give, if someone went with him, he gave them elbow privileges, which meant that if he was sleeping quietly, he was not to be disturbed. But if he started snoring, you could. And then you'd read his review, which he would write, overnight. And it was just the most perceptive and detailed thing. The guy. But anyway, he took me under wing. And for a couple of years, every review I wrote, I Xeroxed it, and I sent it to him, and I would periodically report to the Chelsea Hotel in New York for the postmortems. And he had them all read. I still have them. And it was amazing. It was just amazing, what I learned from him. But he, in terms of writing about music, whether you agree with what he's saying or not, nobody was better. Nobody.
So maybe we'll just talk a little. I have one more question about criticism for you, Tony,
Okay.
and then maybe we'll try to open it up
Okay.
after that and take some of all of your questions. It just strikes me, hearing the stories about coming of age for yourself as a critic in the era of Virgil, and you've been doing this now at the Times for 20 years, and before that, earlier also at the Times, and then at the Boston Globe.
Right.
There's been some really seismic shifts in the world of classical music, in the media landscape since then. I was a freelancer at the New York Times between 2003 and 2006, and at that point, there was a big cutback, but at that point there were still three dedicated critics on the staff who were reviewing full time. Now there's just you as a full-time critic, as a full-time critic, plus an editor who also reviews. Then of course there's all of the aspects of that the internet has brought, right. And in a way, well, we can talk more about that part of it. It seems like this sense that it's been, in a way, that the internet is a wonderful democratizing instrument for everyone really being able to share what they think about, well, anything, but music in particular. And at the same time, I feel like it's led to an idea of a kind of, if everyone's a critic in the age of the internet, then also in a way nobody's a critic. Right. And there's a kind of skepticism almost about even the idea of expertise.
Right.
And so I wonder, sort of against the backdrop of what we're seeing today, how you see your own role at the Times currently, and how it's changed, and really what are the parts that are the most important to you, the most important aspects of the job at this point?
Yeah, I have to be back in New York tomorrow, because we're having a big meeting with our 16 staff critics, in our department, which is no other paper can. And then we have all our freelancers too. So we do, and we also have a full-time reporter writing about classical music and dance. But the expertise thing is, a critic if you understand this in the very best sense, to me, a critic is a generalist. We could hire somebody who's an expert in Gershwin to review Porgy and Bess. It's plausible, but I think that journalism believes, in the way criticism has been practiced, that you have trustworthy voices, that I know opera. I've been a music director of operas. I've accompanied singers. I made a recording with singers, but I love contemporary music. I know all sorts of music. I have all sorts of experience. I'm not some opera crazoid. I'm not some opera fanatic. And I also write for a paper where if I'm writing a review of Wagner opera, I'm writing for Wagner scholars, I'm writing for Wagner conductors, Wagner singers, I'm writing for people who've never seen a Wagner opera. And I have to try to find something to say to all of them in the best sense, So in a way, the critic becomes, maybe I'm not the biggest expert, but I hope what I've developed is trustworthiness. That I'm a good source. I'll tell you that I'll look beyond just did I like it, did I not like it. That was one thing of Virgil's that he emphasized, that it's a discipline of description. You have to. That's your job, to describe, and that people will know what you think about it by the way you describe it, but you have to describe it, and that's the way I think about the expertise thing. I think I have expertise, but I'm not saying I have more, or that's my expertise is what got me this job. I think what got me the job is that I'm broad-minded. I'm curious about things. I'm not a know-it-all. That I really try to see, what is this artist trying to do? What is this composer trying to do? What does this mean for the New York Philharmonic that they've taken this venture, or commissioned this piece? And that's where I think the critics still can be very, very valuable, very, very helpful. To say I'm the same way people feel that way about columnists. Op-ed columnists. Some of your once in a while a column, you have Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize economist, but you have people like Maureen Dowd and Frank Bruni and and Dave Leonhardt and all sorts of people who just are trustworthy, experienced people, and that's why you read them.
Right. I mean, right, there's the trustworthiness aspect that you hope would be there for a critic. I think that also another aspect of it can be a way that one thing we can do as critics is put out there certain sensibilities as a way of responding to music, to art, to thinking about the questions that it raises, and making connections between the art form that we're writing about and other aspects of that same art form, or horizontal connections across to different ones. And so I sometimes think of it as a responsibility of kind of articulating a certain sensibility of responding to art. And for me, as a reader, if the critic has an interesting sensibility, if hearing concerts through the prism of their mind and their sensibility is an interesting one, then is an interesting experience, then one tends to want to read more of them, and I think that can be another aspect of the job.
I almost when I've taught a little bit or talked about it, in a certain kind of way, almost every review is mixed in that you're saying, even when I love something, I'm often saying, I know it's not this, but it's this. There's a pianist I love, Leif Ove Ansnes, Norwegian pianist, and some people find him a little cool, and I write to that. When I write about him, I'll say, I know he's a little Nordic, maybe a little, but to me, it's like a gift. He's laying out this Schumann piece, this, Schubert sonata or something. It was like, let me show you how this piece goes.
Right.
And it's everything is so beautiful. And then when he does tug on a phrase of something, it's overwhelming because he hardly does that.
Right.
But I write to what my goal is. It's funny. I know critics who say, I don't care if people agree with me. And I'll think, well, okay, that's the way to be a critic. My goal, I want everybody who reads me to agree with me.
Right.
I really do. But I don't say, like using Ansnes as an example, I'm not saying he's the greatest pianist in the world. I'm saying I want you to agree that you see what I see is special in him. You may still have your favorite pianist, but do you see, I want somebody to say, oh yeah, he's really good. Tommasini's right, he's really good. So in that sense, I do want everyone to agree with me.
and the aspect of describing his playing or whatever it is in a way that really brings it across for someone who is not even in the concert hall or might not even.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I always think back to one of the most meaningful letters I received from a reader, probably in all my time writing, happened to be early on when I was with you at the Times, and one day back then we would get actual letters, and I opened up the mail and it was someone responding to something I had written, basically just to say, thank you for your descriptions of the piece, because I am writing to you, I think from somewhere in the American Southwest, she wrote, and she said, I'm incarcerated and I don't have opportunity to ever hear live music, and reading whatever the piece it was gave me a little bit of a sense of contact with that sound. Right. So that the fact that the medium can also do that can bring a little bit of the concert far from where and when it took place, because with a novel, anyone can pick it up after they've read the review, but most of what we write about is over, right? Yeah.
Although that's one of the benefits of the digital everything, because everybody has their own websites now, and they have YouTube videos, and you can include that stuff in your reviews sometimes.
Right. So I'm going to see if I can pull up my Slido account here and take and relay some of your questions to Tony. Okay. why don't we start with maybe the briefest one here, and will take us back to the subject of the book, is the question, how do you personally define genius in music? You have a book of geniuses here, you call them indispensable. You don't tend to use the word genius very much. Maybe that's on purpose.
It is sort of on purpose. That was one thing Virgil Thompson taught me. He said, be careful of nouns. Nouns are names, and they're libelous. So you can say somebody is wonderful, but you don't say they're a wonder. And same thing with genius. I use the word ingenious a lot. Somebody is ingenious. Genius is too defining. But I mean, it's also intangible. I mean, ingenious is a kind of fudge word because it allows you to say, well, there's something that Sondheim, for example, is doing that, I don't know, it's really amazing. But maybe he couldn't even be precise about it. But I don't know, I thought greatness was embraced. I mean, indispensables was, the one thing I knew was I didn't want greatness in the title. And the title of the book, The Indispensable Composers, A Personal Guide. The subtitle is very important because it's personal. But to me, genius is too hard to pin down. Greatness, we know it sort of when we hear it, I think. I don't mind the word. I just didn't want it in the title of my book.
Sure. Well, that also touches on, I guess, the top question for us here about this. The questioner writes, how do the subjective and the universal interact in greatness? So I guess getting at this question of who the we is when you speak about we knowing this or that aspect of it, I guess it is the indispensable part of things suggests a kind of universal claim to that greatness, and yet you're also saying it's a personal guide. So I'll ask you the question about the subjective versus the universal and these kinds of assessments.
I mean, of course it's music, the arts, our love of it is subjective. Of course it is, look at a composer like Philip Glass, who's some people, he just takes them to this realm. It's like practically mystical and spiritual, and I'm not this huge fan, but and I think there are a lot of poor pieces. But boy, that Met production of Satyagraha was unbelievable. It was mesmerizing. It was just fantastic. But he has gotten all sorts of critical grief all throughout his whole career. I mean, that's just one of countless examples. And I learned a lot when I was in college, and there were all these classmates who weren't classical musicians, but they started. It's interesting when I try to turn people onto things. For some people, the romantic stuff is what really grained these big sweeping things. Wow, other people were bored by it. It seemed melodramatic, and for a lot of people, it was Baroque music. That was more rock-like or something, and that's very subjective. But yet, it's based on something. I know I understood what they were responding to in each case. But yes, of course. But as a critic, I really try to. Of course, I'm subjective, but I really try to hear every composer. Certainly, especially new pieces. I try to see, okay, what are they going for? What are they trying for?
And when we all have our subjective preferences, when you do have one that extends perhaps to an entire style of music, do you feel somehow compelled to put that into a review, to say, to contextualize your response, through the prism of these larger preferences?
Yeah, I tend not to. I hope I haven't put a whole style of music into.
Just to clarify.
But there are pieces that I certainly feel that. I mean, I'll do it sometimes with humor too. I think I don't think it would hurt the Four Seasons to be retired for 10 or 20 years. I think, and do I really need to hear Dvorak's New World Symphony again? I don't think so, But I'll be a little funny and snarky or something if I say. Whereas other things, the Messiah, you gotta say, that is a piece worth hearing at least once a year. It really, another piece, not quite my field, but sort of, the Nutcracker of Tchaikovsky.
Mm-hmm.
That is terrific music, first class music. So maybe that it deserves it. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly things I'm tired of and things, but I tend to invite people to laugh at me. Like if I don't like it.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I'm also was thinking about, I think you mentioned Philip Glass. That, to my mind, is kind of a great example because minimalism and this kind of repetitive, sort of harmonically simple, but sort of endlessly repetitive music that's changing slowly over time. For some people, they will get into, some listeners will find a lot of kind of almost a kind of a profundity that's maybe in the direction of certain Eastern meditative practices, and it's a whole portal to a kind of a spiritual kind of listening. And for other people, it's just endless arpeggios going on and with no no sense behind it at all. And so it's one of these things where it is tricky to write about and respond to as a critic, where without kind of saying on what side of the divide you personally fall.
Even Alan Kozin, my former critic, colleague who was a big Philip Glass fan, admitted in a big Sunday piece once that he has written a lot of bad pieces. And he said sometimes the new Philip Glass piece, the big question before it starts is, will the da-da-da-da, the minor third that begins da-da-da-da-da-da, will it start on the lower note, da-da-da-da, or the upper one, da-da-da?
So we have a question here from an audience member. How did you enter the field of criticism with your background as an instrumentalist?
That's a Boston story and an Emerson story. I was teaching with Scott Wheeler at Emerson, and I didn't get tenure. And that's a whole nother story. But I knew Richard Dyer at the Boston Globe, and I sort of volunteered myself. I mean, I knew him a little, and I said, "Hey, you want to try me out?" And he did, and they started using me right away. And he taught me a lot too. I learned a lot from him. Even just the basic things of how to write a review, how to do an interview, it was all a big surprise. It just came as a surprise. I was teaching, and I loved teaching, and I was playing the piano a lot, but sometimes the moral of the story, the best thing that ever happened to me in my career was not getting tenure at Emerson College, because none of this would have happened to me. And the thing I often spin this into advice for younger people is that I want to be a violinist, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a minister, I want to be a scientist. That's great, and that will get you through a lot of rough times, but you don't want to be so focused on that something comes along that you hadn't thought of, and you say, oh, no, I'm so glad I didn't think I'm going to get another teaching job. I don't care if I have to go to Montana, I'm going to get another teaching job. I thought, no, here I am in Boston, let me see what I can do. I have other skills. So I said, well, let me see where this leads, and look what it led to, Also, a kind of funny thing, when I was first at the Globe, all my colleagues were very neurotic about writing, like it was so hard. And I was kind of nonchalant about it because I felt like I'm just a piano player, So if I wrote something that wasn't that great, I thought, well, what do you want? If it was really good, I'd think, gosh, look at that. I'm just a piano player, and look at that piece. It's really good. I was neurotic about my piano playing, but now I've been a writer long enough that I'm neurotic about my writing too.
So we have another question, Tony. The subject has come up about our sort of living in an era of hyper-specialization and the separation between, over the course of the 20th century, largely between the creators and the performers of music. And so the question writer asks, in your mind, is a composition better or different when the composer performs it themselves?
I think it's certainly interesting and revealing when the composer performs it themselves, and that was the whole tradition of classical music. Performers, there was no such thing as being a composer without being a performer. Of course, you were both. And it's only in the 20th century that they really got separated, and that was part of all the things that happened. I have to say, it's coming back. There are this young composer pianist Conrad Tao, and Thomas Addis also is not only a very good conductor, he's a very good pianist. But I'm glad that it's coming back. But it's an interesting thing. All the composers I know say the same thing, that they can be very, very helpful in the initial stages when performers are learning their new piece. But at some point, they have to leave, and let them. Okay, now it's their piece. They're gonna have to do it the way they do it, and it may not be the way the composer would do it. And that's fine, and that should be. But yes, we have Stravinsky's, one of the great treasures of the legacy of classical music is we have him conducting, practically all of his works. And it's not the last word, in performances, but boy, to have that record, wow, is it valuable.
Right.
Yeah.
And even when it's not a composer conducting his or her own music, but still a very experienced composer picking up the baton in front of an orchestra.
Absolutely, yeah.
You have it's immediately a different kind of thing where it's in the best moments it can be a sense of one artist kind of in dialogue, really grappling with another through time, and you're sort of able to listen in.
See, that's what really made Bernstein as a conductor Bernstein for me. It wasn't all the dynamism and excitement. Of course, he had that. He conducted Mahler or Beethoven like he had written it. He said he just took it over.
You might have half believed that.
Yeah, I think he may have, but it sure worked. Yeah. Well, that was one. I'm sorry. That was one. Boy, when I was young, hearing him at the New York Philharmonic, Eroica Symphony, first half, Rite of Spring, second half. Wow.
It's interesting that the book has a lot of these great memories of particular performances, but also one of the wonderful things about the work you've been able to do, and our privileged role as critics is being able sometimes to have encounters with artists in the heart of things, creators who to whom we can ask all kinds of questions in the moment about writing a preview, for example, or a profile of an artist, and you have to then spend time with them. And one of the very touching stories in your book involves one of those encounters, and I wondered if you'd like to share it with us. You played a little bit from the score of Rent, and you had also an opportunity to sit down with Jonathan Larson. Do you care to share that story?
I don't know if I can get through it. That was an amazing thing. It was 1996, and I heard that this young musical theater composer had a show that was being done at the New York Theater Workshop, which is a very important place, but only seats 150 people. And it was a kind of modern updating of the La Boheme story about Bohemians, but except the disease killing people was AIDS and was drug addiction and all this East Village rock scene. And so I went to a dress rehearsal, and it was the first time they were in that space. And technically, the show was a mess. Everything was going wrong. It was the first time they were in the space. And they had like 10 days of previews before it was going to open. I sat there thinking, I don't know how they're going to get the show together in 10 days. But if they do, they have something. This is something. So after the show, I sat down. The only quiet place I could find to talk to Jonathan Larson was the little tiny box office of this theater. It was like a closet, and we sat in there and talked for about an hour. He was 35, and he had just quit his job after 10 years as a waiter, at this little dive in the village, and he said, I've got this, between this show and other, I think I'm going to be able to make a life as a composer. And he said that, and lyricist, and he had friends dying who were ill with AIDS, and he said that the moral of Rent is that it's not how long you live, but what you do with your life. So it was by now midnight, and we shook hands, and I went home, and he went home. He put a kettle of water on the stove in his apartment to make tea, and collapsed and died of an aortic aneurysm. And I don't know whether I was the last person to talk to him. He may have seen somebody else in the theater, but I was. And so then I wound up getting intensely involved in his story and his life. I met his parents, I met his family, I met his friends. I wrote a couple big pieces about it. And but his family and his friends are still incredibly grateful to me, because Johnson used to go around saying, you watch, someday I'm going to win a Tony Award, someday I'm going to have an interview in the New York Times. And his parents felt that, because the first thing I told them was how much I liked the show, and so Tony Award, he not only won the Pulitzer Prize, for drama, but posthumously, but he at least knew that he got his New York Times interview, and that by somebody who really liked his work, and it's just a terrible, terrible story. But also, boy, I almost didn't go that night. I could have gone the next night. I was finishing another piece. I thought, let me go, and we had La Boheme, and he loves La Boheme, but and so do I. It was the 100th anniversary of Boheme. It was, it had been 1896, so. Yeah, it was amazing. I almost felt like we were meant to meet, and it was something,
Well, I think I'm told that we have our time for tonight is up, but that Tony is not going anywhere. He's going to be outside in the lobby, where I'm told that books will be for sale, and please join me with thanking Anthony Tommasini.
Thank you.